I waited to make this video because I'm not a sourdough expert, so watch this video. But then I realized I'll never be a sourdough expert, and you probably don't want to be a sourdough expert either. You just want to make some good homemade sourdough, which I can give you. So let's not waste time. I'm going to show you how to make your own delicious sourdough bread, despite breaking many of the rules. First, you need a sourdough starter. Steal it from your neighbor, or better yet, make your own. It's easy, it's fun, and you only have to make it once, and then you'll forever be able to make sourdough bread. I'll have that video linked for you. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get our dough ready. Now, you can alter this schedule, but for what it's worth, feed your starter the night before. So Sunday night, let's say. I try to feed my starter right before I go to bed because otherwise it will have peaked and fallen quite a bit. And ideally, we want our starter to be as active as possible. Bubbly and doubled in size-ish, not falling and less bubbly. But don't get too hung up on this. I'll talk to you more about that later. Monday morning, whenever I wake up, I mix my ingredients using a scale. If you don't have a scale, you can use cups. Don't worry, I'll have this recipe linked in its entirety for you guys below. And I like this recipe because it's a good hydration level for me. It's easy to work with, and it makes a nice bread that doesn't have the big artisan style holes in it that a higher hydration dough would make. If you like that, you can alter this, but I like to be able to spread stuff on my bread, so I don't want the big holes. So anyway, first add water. I use filtered water because I really don't want to have anything in the water that's going to kill or mess with the microbes that I'm trying to ferment. Then I add my starter. You can do a float test, which involves taking a scoop of unstirred sourdough starter and dropping it into a glass of water to see if it floats. The idea is that if it's active and has lots of CO2 bubbles, that it's gonna float, and if it's not active, it's gonna sink. Do this if you want, but you can get false negatives. I actually frequently do because my starter is usually past peak by the time I wake up in the morning, so it's gonna sink. I also use whole wheat flour, which can also sink because of the way the gluten is. I'm not gonna get into this in too much detail, but just know that if it sinks, it's not the end of the world. I still have bread that rises. It might take me longer to rise, for example, but don't let this throw you off. So let's add the starter. Now I add my salt, and then I just mix everything together. This is probably the second rule I'm breaking because you're supposed to put your flour in, let the gluten in the dough strengthen before you add your salt. But who wants to take a bunch of dough and then try to mix salt in? It's just too difficult. It's gonna stress me out. I like to do it this way, mix it in, call it a day. Now for the flour. I use some bread flour because it has a nice high protein content that's gonna be good for making a beautiful loaf. But I also like to add in a little bit of whole wheat flour because who doesn't want a little bit of whole grains to make them nice and healthy? You could add rye flour, you could mix this up however you want. The more flour you can get all over the place and breathe in, better a baker you are. There's something about just squeezing these last little ones to make it the perfect amount of grams. I'm satisfied now. I'm gonna get this into a nice shaggy mass, but I do want it to be fairly cohesive. And a tip for you when working with dough is to wet your hands. That way the dough isn't going to massively stick to them. I'm not kneading this, I'm just trying to get it all together so the flour can start absorbing the water. Now cover so this doesn't dry out and leave it for at least a half an hour, preferably about an hour. You don't have to get stressed about the timing, definitely. I never set a timer, I just do it whenever I think about it. This is gonna help the water get absorbed and the gluten network start to form before we start stretching. Then I do about 3 sets of stretches and folds about a half an hour apart. Go all the way around in a full circle. Don't get stressed about the timing here. As long as you do them every now and then when you come into the kitchen, you'll be fine. Then I leave the dough and let it ferment. Although I have been known to stretch and fold again, even during fermentation, because maybe I went out somewhere and just didn't get a chance to stretch and fold enough in the beginning. But generally I just leave it. We want the dough to rest and ferment and rise and not become too tight. So how long should you let your dough rest? Until it doubles in height, more or less. Although this isn't fully accurate because dough at a higher temperature will actually not necessarily double in height, because if it's above like 80 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, it might relax some and not necessarily rise as high. So here's the deal. Just wait until your dough has risen a bunch and you'll get a feel for this. It's going to depend on the temperature of your house, how active your starter was. Mine often isn't that active, as I mentioned before. So it might take me a good 9 hours or even up to 11 hours to ferment my dough. Some people might only need 5 hours, and this could also vary based on the type of flour you're using. Okay, so now it's late on Monday. I've done my stretching and folding. I've let my dough rise, but I don't want to bake my bread tonight. So I'm going to put it in the fridge. That's going to slow down the fermentation, and it can do its final rise overnight in the fridge. This way, it doesn't overproof before the morning. I'll talk about overproofing in a second. This is how you shape your dough. Lightly flour your work surface. Fold on each side like this. And then do these little nice circles so that your dough gets a nice tight skin. This final rise, or proofing as it's called, which I'm gonna let happen in the refrigerator, just really helps that shaped dough relax and expand as it continues to just develop that nice, airy, light structure that we want. If you don't want to put your dough in the refrigerator and you want to bake tonight, that's fine. Just know that your dough is probably going to need to do its final proof for about 2 hours or so at room temperature. Now, in the morning, to make sure your dough is ready right before you throw it in the oven, you can do a poke test. You want to poke, and if the dough springs back slowly and partially, you're golden. If the dough springs back quickly and fully, it's not ready. And if there's no spring, it's probably overproofed. Overproofing, you're gonna know it. It's gonna look like a disaster and you're gonna be really sad. And this is gonna happen because you're gonna get absent-minded like I've done, and you're gonna take your bowl and you're gonna sit it on the counter right beside the refrigerator. But you're not gonna put it in the refrigerator because that would be too smart. You're gonna leave it out all night long. And the next morning, when you go to open your fridge, you're gonna look right beside it and you're gonna see the bowl with a soggy mess of dough. But the beauty of it is this can still be used. Oil a baking sheet or put a silicone mat or something on it, spread this all over it, add some herbs if you want, and bake. And you're gonna have a nice flatbread that you can still use for sandwiches or whatever you want. Now it's time to get our bread in the oven. I heat my Dutch oven for about a half an hour before I throw my bread in there. I want to get it nice and steamy. If you don't have a Dutch oven, you can get creative. Google it. There are ways. Score your bread. Don't be shy. Make sure you don't have a really shallow score. You can use a knife, but it doesn't work well. So you're going to want to get a razor blade. And then I like to bake my bread for 20 minutes covered. And then to get it nice and brown, I bake my bread for exactly 23 minutes uncovered. Adjust for your oven, obviously. You can't buy bread at the store that looks like that. Crispy crust. We'll cut into this and it's gonna be light and fluffy like a cloud. Are you totally overwhelmed? Don't be. As soon as you start doing this, it becomes such an easy process. And you're always gonna have the option of having fresh bread in your house without even having to go to the grocery store. It's beautiful. It could be snowing outside and you're gonna have fresh bread. So don't get caught in the details. If you've got dough that's fermented, you're gonna be able to make some sort of bread. This is much healthier than anything you're gonna buy at the store. And you're gonna fall in love with this process, and then you're gonna want a cow and some chickens like me. And remember to eat real food. I'll see you in the next video.